Hi everyone, and welcome to video number 23 on the American West. And this one concerns the event known as the massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890. Very famous book there by a historian called D. Brown, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. Now, in the previous video, we looked at the Battle of Little Bighorn, and we saw that it was a great victory for the Plains Indians. But, as we found out, things went very wrong very quickly. In the words of the Bee Gees and Steps, tragedy. When you lose control and you got no soul, it's tragedy. Well, it was a tragedy for the Plains Indians after the Battle of Little Bighorn. Many Indians, including Sitting Bull, were forced back onto the reservations. By the end of the 1880s, most Indians felt dismay, despair, and disillusionment. Then, sadly for them, there were two more body blows. First of all, the United States government cut the rations to the reservations. Secondly, in the summer of 1890, there was a severe drought. Both of these led to a shortage of food. The crops failed. The situation was extremely grim. And this led to something known as the ghost dance. The Specials, one of my favourite bands. This town becoming like a ghost town. Well, the reservations in some way were like a ghost town. This is what happened. You've got to remember, in the way of life of the Plains Indians, there we have a totem pole. Spirits, visions, dreams. The spirit world was very important. It was very influential in their lives, played a big part in their lives. And at this time, 1890, an Indian, Paiute Indian called Wovoka, W-O-V-O-K-A, said that he'd had a vision. And in this vision, he'd been told by the spirits, if the Indians rejected the white way of life, in other words, the reservations, and instead wearing a special ghost shirt, still made from buffalo skin, just cloth. But this special ghost shirt, they believed, would be bulletproof. And if they wore the ghost shirt and did a sacred ghost dance, then certain things would follow. Number one, Indians who'd been killed before would come back to life. Number two, a flood would wash away all the white people out of their lands, so that then the Indians themselves could return and regain their land. Now, to us, that might seem a bit strange, but it gave them hope in a seemingly hopeless situation. So it became very popular, ladies and gentlemen. So popular that people started doing it all over the reservations, this ghost dance. Now, the government agents, government officials who ran the reservations, known as the Indian agents, they became very worried. They tried to ban the ghost dance, but that failed. So they had to call on the United States government for help and assistance. So President Harrison, President of America at the time, he sent in the army with orders to stop the ghost dance and restore the control. Now, what happened next? Well, first of all, they tried to arrest Sitting Bull. The officials and the army feared, incorrectly, by the way, that Sitting Bull was planning another rebellion. Remember? He'd been involved at Little Bighorn in the sort of attempts to arrest and deal with Sitting Bull. Sitting Bull was killed. So what would happen then? Well, his followers, seeing that their leader had been killed, not surprisingly, they were scared, they were upset, they were angry, they ran away, and they joined up with another group of Indians led by their leader called Bigfoot, and they tried to get away from the army. But they were slowed down by the snow. It was winter. They were slowed down by a lot of them getting ill. They had pneumonia. So it was inevitable that the army eventually caught up with this group of Indians. And they captured them, I suppose is the word, and they took them all to a place called Wounded Knee Creek. Wounded Knee. There we have it. 29th of December 1890. Remember I said it was winter, the winter snows. It was all confusion in the camp where these Indians were being kept. Remember, one of the orders for the army was to restore control. So they said, we need to take all the Sioux weapons away from them. One Sioux warrior resisted this. Now some say he was deaf and he was sat with his back to the soldiers who were saying, give us your weapons. Now, whatever the truth of the situation, it's difficult to know now. All we can say for definite is that trouble started. It was a confused, a hectic situation. Trouble started, fighting started. Some of the Indians started to do the ghost dance. All of a sudden, a shot was fired. And then a lot more shots. The army got involved. When I say the army, ladies and gentlemen, I mean the 7th Cavalry. Now, where have we seen these people before? 7th Cavalry, Battle of Little Bighorn, as we know. So the 7th Cavalry, ladies and gentlemen, they opened fire. And this time they did have their repeating rifles with them. Also this time they had what were called Hotchkiss cannons, a bit like machine guns. They had 4 of them. And they opened fire. In the melee, in the fighting, in the conflict. It only lasted 10 minutes, ladies and gentlemen. A little bit shorter than this video. In that time, 25 soldiers were killed, but 250 Indians, men, women, children, were killed. This became known as the massacre at Wounded Knee. Bigfoot himself, the leader, was killed. Many of the Indians were buried in a mass grave. So that's the events. That's what happened at Wounded Knee. Let's have a look at what we could call the impacts or the consequences of the massacre at Wounded Knee. 6 of them altogether. Number 1. This was the final clash, the final conflict between the Indians and the army. Number 2, the Sioux tribe, winners at the Battle of Little Bighorn, ladies and gentlemen, they no longer fought the army. The sight of their ghost shirts, remember they thought it would protect them, but the ghost shirts were pierced by the bullets, blood-stained. This forever ended the idea that somehow their faith, their spirits, could help them in their struggle. The Indians, albeit reluctantly, returned and remained on the reservations. Later on, years, decades later, Wounded Knee, the events at Wounded Knee, did become a symbol for civil rights campaigners who were fighting to protect and win rights for the Plains Indians. But that was for the future. At that time in 1890, after Wounded Knee, ladies and gentlemen, from the Indian perspective, it was all over. So there's the consequences for the Indians. What about the other side? For the Americans? Well, number 4, public opinion, the great American public, they thought, good. We praised what the soldiers did. They were very supportive of the army's actions. Why? Well, they feared the ghost dance. They feared maybe again the Indians would come and fight, and they wanted to get rid of that fear. So they supported the actions of the 7th Cavalry. It had become quite a common view across America that the Plains Indians, they would never change their way of life. They would remain hostile, if you like, to the white way of life. So if they wouldn't change, many people felt the only option was to get rid of them. So from that perspective, the massacre at Wounded Knee would be seen as a success. Finally, 1890, the last consequence, the United States government declared that the Indian frontier was over. Nowhere in America anymore would there be land which would be allowed to belong to any other nation, any other people, in other words, the Plains Indians. So they were the consequences of the massacre at Wounded Knee, from the Indian perspective and from white America's perspective. Just before we finish, would you say that Wounded Knee was revenge for the Battle of the Little Bighorn? There were 14 years between the two events, but both of them had the 7th Cavalry involved. Were the 7th Cavalry out for revenge? It's uncertain, really. I'll give you two ideas, leave it for you to make your own mind up. One of the 7th Cavalry men who was at Wounded Knee, a man called Jesse Harris, he said, "I heard the older men say, this is where we got even for the Battle of Little Bighorn." So maybe, according to that perspective, from that stance, you could say, yes, maybe the 7th Cavalry were out for revenge. However, another of the men who was at Wounded Knee said, it was a thing to melt the heart of a man to see those little children. So he appears to be being quite sympathetic to the Indians. Whether it was revenge or not, in a way, that's a side issue. All we do know is that it was the end. So, Black Elk, very famous Indian, later in his life, as he was a very old man, spoke about his life being a holy man of the Oglala Sioux. He'd been there at all of those big events. And he said, he was talking about the massacre at Wounded Knee. And Black Elk said, a people's dream died there. It was a beautiful dream. That's what he said. It was the end. In the words of the great Frank Sinatra, and now the end is near, and so I face the final curtain. It was the end of the traditional way of life of the Plains Indians. How had this occurred? What had happened really to totally end their way of life? Well, the answer will be in the next video. As ever, I hope it's been useful. All the best. See you soon. Bye now.